combines both engineering and science and art into one. It's essentially a sculpture. It's called Listening Post by Ben and Mark Hansen. And it's an art sculpture that essentially it listens to the internet. This is sort of before, this was in the early 2000s that they developed this project. It listens to the internet, and then it essentially speaks using text-to-speech processing. It speaks what it hears. And Mark Hansen is an engineer and a statistician. So he wrote some algorithms that help this the computer that runs this to determine essentially what most people are talking about on the internet. So it listens to chat rooms and to discussion boards and tries to get a sense of what the popular topics are at any particular moment, and then focuses on those and displays the text from them in the display, and then also speaks them. So you get this sense of, by sitting with the sculpture, you get a sense of kind of what the main topics are of the day, and usually it ends up being whatever big news is happening on the internet. So today or yesterday, it might be about this volcano that exploded in Iceland. You would hear and see people having conversations about it, whatever it might be. It might just be people saying that, have you heard that there was a volcano? Or I'm delayed because of the volcano and I can't travel, or these kinds of things. That I think both of these projects are both the project as it exists in the film and the art project are basically both trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to ask the same questions and address the same sort of topics, just from two different vantage points. So I want to conclude with quickly. One is I want to just sort of underscore the what I think is important. So I'm not just doing it because I'm a science fiction fan, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn from science fiction and how it can sort of shape what we imagine the world to be like, or how we imagine it could be different. And there's so many wonderful examples that I wish I could share with you that continue on that theme. There's one, it was basically just a very short film that someone made on their own that I think it captures so much of what I'm trying to do that I almost can't describe it with words. So perhaps it's better I'll show it and then we can talk about it quite briefly.
Maybe because I don't really like New York that much. New York is cool, but it's not like my favorite place. To New York, yeah. But I've never been to LA, so I don't know.
Looks like that. Oysters, because I think you
Red Chinese down the drain. We'll all end up there with you.
So I really love that film, mostly because it's something that I wish I could do. It is this thing in essentially helping us imagine. Obviously, it's science fiction, but is it? It helps us imagine what the world might be like if there were the Star Wars universe were somehow part of our everyday life. And what it does that I think is quite effective is that it makes that world seem entirely possible. It makes it seem quite ordinary. It makes it possible in that film to imagine that this world could exist. There's nothing, there's no drama to it. It's not like a big catastrophe happens or the Earth is taken over. That's just how the world is. There is the Star Wars universe exists amongst us, and that is, I think, one of the most important aspects of what science fiction is able to do and helps create and imagine, even just slightly different parts of the world, is that it makes these kinds of really very speculative new ideas seem entirely possible. So they become these kinds of things that otherwise might be hard to communicate or might be hard to convince someone that this could possibly, the world could possibly be this way. And that's something that why I think it's also important to pay attention to stories, to books, to science fiction film, is because it's able to essentially take this thing that we might not be prepared entirely to accept, but allows us to suspend our conventional disbelief. It allows us to imagine, just as when you read a really good bit of a fiction book, you hear a really good story, you want to become a part of that story. You want it to be part of your life and part of your world. And so you don't have those usual reactions that you might have to say like, oh, that's not possible, because then it doesn't make doesn't make the film or doesn't make the story enjoyable. If you refuse to allow yourself to engage in that world, then nothing, that next magical thing doesn't happen. And so I think learning how to tell a good story, learning how to make something that seems out of this world, make it seem quite ordinary, is a really important skill to develop and understand and appreciate. And there's just one or two other things. So one thing that I would sort of recommend to you, which we don't have time to get into now, is this film called How William Shatner Changed the World. And maybe you can get it there. Sometimes you can find it on the internet, I'm pretty sure, but you can also find it in some places on DVD. And it's absolutely very funny, but also very serious sort of documentary about the science behind Star Trek. And we get introduced to people whose lives were really changed. They became engineers and they became scientists and doctors because of the things that they saw on Star Trek. Even the guy who invented the mobile phone is in the film, and he says, look, I saw what the technology that they had in Star Trek when I was a kid, and it's like I really wanted to build that. And so that kind of really very, very fascinating crosstalk between the science and the fiction and the fact and the engineering and how it inspires people to do the things they do. There's also this wonderful book, which I think you should have in your library, called Starfleet Tech Manual, which essentially goes through, as if it were real, how to build the different devices and props that exist in Star Trek. And what I find most fascinating about this is that someone takes them so seriously that they actually draw these engineering diagrams of the things, and they show what it might look like, or how you might lay it out if you're an engineer. And these are these other kinds of mechanisms that push the idea from just an idea into an actual material object. So these parts that you see here, actually a colleague of mine who is building a communicator, he actually built it. He built a communicator, and he used just sort of his imagination and some of the references from the existing props. And we were in the studio that I work in, we were asked by the producers of the most recent Star Trek film to imagine what the Star Trek communicator might look like in the years before this existed. So if you remember the Star Trek film that just came out, it's meant to take place, I don't know, it's like 20 or 25 years before the Star Trek, the original Star Trek. So the design kind of like brief was design the thing that comes before the communicator, which is sort of interesting. Another one of these interesting problems about speculating about what the world might look like. And I think just because of the interest of time and because and you might have some questions, I think I'll just stop there. So this is how you can find out where I am. This is where I sort of blog at. I work at in a design studio here, and this is where this is my Twitter name, both of these two.